Welcome to Creative or Dead, a podcast about living a creative life.
We're your hosts, Alicia Callahan
and David Constantine.
Come with us as we interview all sorts of people about their creative practice. Hi, David.
Hey, Alicia.
So we just had an interview with Jack Lovel. Jack is an architecture and interiors photographer. He built his career doing commercial work, but about 10 years ago started doing some solo projects. These were self-initiated kind of creative pursuits, and they have ended up becoming a real passion of his, being turned into books. And one of these books actually will be out in September. It's called Riverside Modern, The Legacy of Studley Park, and it will be published by Thames and Hudson. But yeah, Jack really shares this kind of how he approaches his work and his creative pursuits in this podcast. But what was something that, piqued your interest?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's lots in there, and it was great to hear Jack talk about his process and, the way that he brings life to his work, photographing the built environment. I guess what was interesting for me that almost transcended photography as a discipline was Jack talking about the development of his creative process and his professional creativity. Even before the interview, when we were doing our pre-record chat, he'd meticulously prepared for what he thought he was going to talk about with the questions. And you can see the same characteristics in the way he talks about his work. He's meticulously prepared for the work, but then as he's matured in his creative practice, he talks us through how he's then deliberately started to push himself and to create the space to ask those questions. What if we try this? Or how about we do that? To really loosen up his all the rigor and the foundation of his preparation to then get into expression mode. And, we talk about flow state a lot on this podcast. So to hear him come from a background of meticulousness and attention to detail, and then to see his creative maturation into having all of that as a foundation from which to launch and to get into that flow state and make work that's really human. And of course, the conversation about AI comes up as part of that, and it's another one to look out for. But really interesting reflection on the trajectory of creative process and mastery.
Yeah, I really hope you enjoyed this one. Hello, Jack Lovel, and welcome to Creative or Dead.
Hi, Alicia and David. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so I feel like I need to preface this to any listeners that I consider Jack a dear friend. So this might be quite at times it might sound like a friendly chat, which is also very ideal listening kind of conversation. So
I can give some awkward interjections at different points if you like. Really, really informal.
An objective perspective.
That's right. Yeah, some tough curly ones.
So we always like to ask our guests to introduce themselves, so then you can almost go as far back into your creative journey as you like. But I guess, introducing who you are and what you do.
Jack Lovel, I'm an architectural photographer based here in Melbourne, where I sort of established my practice. I've been here for the last sort of 15 years or so. I primarily kind of work in Australia, and more recently I've been doing some work abroad in the US. I guess sort of looking back at my journey and kind of how I got into architectural photography, my sort of initial interest in photography came about in my late teens through a good friend of mine, fellow photographer who now lives in Paris, Jacob. And he sort of first showed me how to use a camera. It was when we sort of took our first trip to Europe together, I think around 2006 it was. Prior to that, I'd sort of, hadn't really picked up a camera or sort of had much to do with photography. So that was sort of my first foray into kind of using a camera, and sort of through some initial travels overseas, sort of sparked my interest in it. Around that time, I was sort of, out of high school, working out what I wanted to do, sort of always felt that I wanted to pursue a career in something that was creative. Thought I wanted to be a graphic designer originally, actually, but just turned out I couldn't really draw all that well. So decided to scrap that. But yeah, so sort of picked up the camera. I was sort of traveling a bit, and I'd always kind of had a real interest in architecture, and I think the sort of the built environment and cityscape. So that's sort of the subject matter that kind of drew my eye, and what I quite enjoyed photographing. So around this time, I actually applied for architecture school and had the meeting and got accepted, but for whatever reason, sort of didn't hold my nerve and kind of didn't back myself into do it. And actually ended up switching into drafting. So I did 2 years of drafting, sort of architecture adjacent, I guess, but I found the content a little bit dry, to say the least. From there, sort of around 2008, I'd taken a trip to New York for the first time, come back with a series of photographs and sort of with a bit of encouragement, I would say, with some family and friends. I said, oh, look, well, these are sort of quite nice travel photos. Why don't you do something with them? Why don't you sort of maybe have an exhibition? So I ended up doing a little exhibition at a friend's gallery back in Perth, which is sort of where I grew up. Gallery called The Butcher Shop, which is still there, gallery and sort of retail store. And on the back of that, I decided that I was actually going to switch courses. So I went from drafting into photography. I was sort of in my first semester of studying photography that I had a lecturer come up to me one day, and I just remember having a discussion with him. We're in the library and sort of, he was asking me what my interests were and kind of where I saw myself going in this profession. And he sort of advised me that I could actually pursue architectural photography as, like as a career path and sort of just specialize in that. So for me, that was kind of that real sort of light bulb moment. Everything fell into place, this love of architecture and sort of the built environment and cityscapes. And then obviously it was, using sort of the camera to kind of document that. So from then on, that's sort of single-handedly what I've pursued and dedicated myself to. And that's really sort of where my practice is now. But that's, in terms of my sort of story, my background, that was sort of my first foray into it and kind of how I found myself here.
It sounds like you had a lot of people along the way who just kind of were nudging you into the right opportunities as well.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, it was sort of this good friend of mine, Jacob, that kind of first showed me the camera, and then I think encouragement from sort of family as well. That definitely helped. I do distinctly remember one of the lecturers telling us day one or two, sort of when I started the course, that none of us would actually make it as a commercial photographer. And that's always sort of stood out in my mind. So they really kind of set the expectation that, it's a very, very tough career to pursue. And so, I'm thankful for all of those who've kind of offered me encouragement along the way. And I mean, even now, like it's sort of, it definitely, all of us from time to time need to be uplifted and sort of encouraged in our practice and the ebbs and flows of that. So yeah, I'm definitely grateful for that.
Do you think that your initial interest prior to photography in architecture and the built form, does that shape the way that you document it? Does that inform the way that you understand your subject?
Yeah, look, I also, going back a bit further into my sort of history. So I actually grew up in a Ivanoff house, which is he was a very significant West Australian architect whose work I've documented extensively. And I mean, people have said to me that, it's no coincidence that I grew up in this architecturally designed home. Sort of, there's been these comments about me sort of being a small child, looking at all the details and sort of, and moments in that house, and I guess how that sort of informed my work and really, had a sort of great impact and sort of influence on my career. So, like I said, going back sort of a little bit further, that was kind of where I started out. And yeah, in answer to your question, I think, I'm quite sort of structured and somewhat, I think sometimes maybe a little bit rigid in my approach, and I've actually really been trying to sort of change that of recent times. But yeah, the sort of that background in sort of the drafting and kind of that interest in architecture, I think that's translated very well into my creative practice, and sort of, I guess, my passion for it as well.
It's interesting. Some of your work obviously has people, and maybe we touch on that in a little bit, but the work that doesn't still seems to have a very narrative emotive quality to the, you're telling a story about, you're not just documenting. It doesn't feel like there's that German couple that went through doing silos in Western Europe in the 1940s that always gets put up in crit theory lectures, which is very like the kind of the cult of objectivity. Your work seems to have a subjective and narrative quality to it. Is that something you construct intentionally, or is it just something that comes out through the work?
Thank you for that feedback. I mean, yeah, look, definitely that is something that is very intentional in my practice. Obviously, as a photographer, you are there always to sort of document the work in one regard. But I think obviously putting your own lens on it, your own eye to it. And I think really just trying to create imagery that's sort of emotive and resonates with the viewer. It's no coincidence that, photographing residential projects, I find it far easier to elicit a response from a viewer than photographing a commercial building or a workplace project or something like that. I'm really sort of, I guess, what drives me always as a photographer is the light and the pursuit of light and sort of that interplay of light and materiality. As the photographer, we sort of come in and we compose and we sort of basically, when a viewer looks at my photographs or a series of photographs that I've created, I want them to ultimately feel like they've experienced that project and sort of at different scales, that project and sort of all the elements behind it. I sort of got told that quite earlier on, even going back to when I was sort of assisting, that when someone looks at your photographs, ideally you want them to feel like they've walked through the front door of the house, and by the end of it, they feel like they've experienced every aspect of it. Now, obviously, it's sort of a curated version, and we ideally show the best part, and sometimes we edit out the parts that the architect doesn't want us to see, or we don't think are as interesting for whatever reason. But I'm always trying to, I guess, build that narrative around a project, like you said, that narrative and having photos that resonate with the viewer and that are emotive by sort of, using the light and to sort of amplify what we're looking at.
I'm reminded of that quote from Cartier-Bresson about taking a photograph is like holding your breath, finding that moment and then capturing that moment for others. Is that something that you think about or experience in your work, Jack?
Yeah, look, definitely. I think when I, looking back on Cartier-Bresson, that idea of the decisive moment as the photographer, that's sort of what we're trying to capture, this almost this fleeting moment in time, this one specific instant for me where it's, a splash of light hitting, the side of a house or the sort of a particular material at the right time of day, and it's sort of fleeting and dropping in and out. I do think about that, and it's obviously there's those sort of moments that we're always chasing as the photographer. It's quite interesting. I think I've found that over time, the photos that seem to sort of quite often resonate with people, or sort of in my work anyway, are always those really sort of like tight details and those abstract moments of just light and materiality. So like down to its sort of simplest, most purest form, and sort of taking out all the visual kind of clutter and noise. So, in terms of explaining a project, you need photographs at a multitude of different scales to really give you an overall picture and to contextualize a specific project. But I could sort of sit there and photograph those, abstract moments all day. So
are you naturally an observer of things? Were you an observer before you were a photographer, or the other way around?
I think my photography practice has taught me to be patient and to look at things in further detail and just to try and stop and kind of analyze before I, proceed. But I think I would say that I've always been a fairly observant person. I've always been drawn to the detail of things and recognize the beauty in the smaller details. I would say that as a photographer, that's sort of really what we do in a way. It's often the things that I like to photograph are sort of sometimes subjects that have been overlooked or aspects of subjects that have been overlooked. Like it's not always about the hero shot or the hero moment. I actually sort of like to go the other way where it's, some of my favorite shots are quite often the obscure details that you wouldn't necessarily think, would actually make for a great photograph or image. But yeah, I would say my practice has taught me patience. And that's something that when I'm talking to people about, doing the work that we do, I think as an architectural photographer, particularly when I'm working in Melbourne, you have to be very patient because the weather can chop and change in an instant. We're chasing the light all day. You have to move quickly and you have to be agile. But patience is definitely a virtue. I think my practice has taught me that. But you want to be observant, but you don't want to wait too long because then you kind of miss what you need to capture. So it's always a fine line.
Yeah.
You mentioned growing up in an Ivanov house, and that that became quite a personal project for you to then go and photograph Ivan Ivanoff's work across Perth and Western Australia. What can you share about that, and sort of where has that led? Because now you kind of balance commercial work with quite a purely personal creative practice as well.
Yeah, look, that project has been really sort of like pivotal in the direction that my career has taken. Sort of going back to 2016 to going on 10 years now since I started that project, researching it. I never thought it would sort of lead me to where I am now. So essentially, back then, I sort of landed on the fact that kind of Ivanov hadn't really been extensively documented at that current point in time. Sort of, there'd been different houses that had been photographed for various publications and by university students and some academics and whatnot over time, but there was no sort of cohesive archive of the work. Growing up in one, obviously, I had that personal connection. So that's sort of really what enabled the project. I first reached out to several owners, explained that I was an architectural photographer, that I was looking to do this personal project. Really, in a lot of ways, to kind of take me away from the commissioned work. I guess sort of for the years before that, I'd assisted architectural photographers and sort of come up, in that pretty sort of standardized path. And I've sort of spent a number of years just kind of really focusing on the commercial or commissioned work, as I refer to it. So when I started the Ivanov work, I really just wanted a project that I could sink my teeth into, that I could dictate the brief, that I could decide how I want to photograph it, that I could decide where I want the work to appear, and sort of not have the constraints of a client kind of dictating what they want, or have to stick to that formula as well of sort of what you have to capture for like an editorial publication. Or there's no sort of written rules, I guess, but I feel like there's a set of expectations that sort of, or things that you need to get out of each particular project if you want to go and take it for editorial purposes. And the reality of working as a commercial photographer is that most clients I deal with want you to help them get their projects published, as you would well know, Alicia. So I think when I reflect on the Ivanov work and where it took me, sort of, at first I started it just because I wanted to document it and photograph it. I sort of, from 2016 to 2019, when I did the first exhibition in Perth, it was June of 2019. That was always the plan. I wanted to do an exhibition in Perth, maybe do something in Melbourne. Didn't really have any grand, like, broader plans for it than that. Obviously, COVID hit, and being a photographer in Melbourne was very, very tricky for those few years. We sort of work just stopped and started on and off for those sort of 2.5 years. So I ended up spending a somewhat extended period of time in Perth, which actually allowed me to photograph more interiors of the Ivanoff work, which subsequently led to me self-publishing my first book. So I did that in collaboration with a good friend of mine, Tim Baker, and we shared a studio space together for a number of years. And so it was a really personal project because it was sort of done during COVID. It was quite a tricky time professionally, like on the commercial side of things. So it was really this personal work that kind of enabled me to, be creative, to make the work I wanted to make. And what started as an exhibition turned into this book. When sort of we started coming out of the haze of COVID, I think it was, March 22, it would have been, I did the exhibition in Melbourne, and that was always the plan. I wanted to exhibit the work in Melbourne. Sort of coinciding with that, I sort of had the team at Monocle reach out to me from London, and they sort of were really interested in the project. The design editor there, Nick Monet, who actually happens to be a landscape architect from Perth originally. He was well aware of Ivanov. So when he saw what I was doing, he was really interested. And I'm a big believer in sort of doors open doors, right? And so he sort of, ended up helping me kind of take that project over to London. I did an exhibition for the London Festival of Architecture. I subsequently sort of ended up taking it to Modernism Week as well in the same year, which is kind of, the mecca for modernist architecture enthusiasts. And so really, yeah, it's been quite amazing how this one personal project, so obviously I had a really deep connection with, has sort of started to open these doors and send my practice off on quite a different trajectory, where nowadays, if I'm really honest, like I'm more or less trying to sort of split my time between almost like half commercial commissioned work, and I'd say equally try and make like nearly half sort of personal work. So whereas previously, before the Ivanov work, it was solely sort of working as like a commercial photographer.
Yeah, I love that. We had a an episode with Jo Hook, and she basically said every creative should have a personal project, because it will just, as you say, open doors to new things, and you're pursuing something purely that is a passion. And so then what has come off the back of that, Jack?
Yeah. So on the back of that, someone once said to me, all roads lead to Perth. And although you might move, although you might move or find yourself back there. So as it transpired, when I was out at Modernism Week in 2023, I was there with Stuart Harrison, who's an architect and was a collaborator on the Ivanov project. We happened to meet up with another fellow Perthian, a guy called Timothy Godbold, who is a very talented interior designer who's now based in New York, splits his time between New York and Miami. And he was out there presenting a book on, he was out there presenting about a non-for-profit that he set up called Hamptons 20th Century Modern. And he gave this brilliant presentation on the history of modernist architecture on Long Island in New York. And Stuart and I sat there and we were just absolutely blown away. So Tim, obviously being from Perth, was a big Ivanoff fan. So of course we connected and we started chatting. And sort of what's come from that has now been a project that's nearly 3 years in the work, but I've actually been working alongside him to document a series of mid-century houses around Long Island in New York, which has just been an absolute pleasure and sort of privilege. When I was sitting there in the depths of COVID, if you told me I'd be out in the Hamptons like 3 summers later, cruising around, photographing sort of a who's who of sort of modernist architecture in that region, I definitely would have said that you were mad and that would never happen. So, the Ivanov project definitely opened that door. I wouldn't have been at Modernism Week otherwise. And, subsequently it's now led to this book that I'm working on with Tim that's going to be published early next year, which we're quite excited about.
Very exciting.
Yes.
Amazing. I mean, with the Ivanov thing, obviously there was the personal history, there was the connection, and part of that encoding, which obviously gave you a real fuel of inspiration for that project. Where else do you find inspiration for your creative practice? What do you look to?
Yeah, I mean, look, as a photographer, I think you can draw inspiration from, a number of different mediums. I would say sort of, if I'm looking around, I try, in terms of my sort of profession and other photographers, there is a photographer whose work I particularly love, a guy called Joe Fletcher, he's based out in California. He's an English guy. And I think what I love about his work as a fellow photographer who documents architecture, is that he has this incredible ability to sort of really capture the essence of a space and almost sort of transport you to being in that space. I think sort of, I'm always kind of driven by the light and I'm, wanting to, like I said, sort of create imagery that sort of will resonate with people. And I think you can, use the light to do that. So when I look at Joe's work, he just has this brilliant ability to sort of capture these moments, and every single shot that you will see has, a beautiful sort of like shadow or sort of cast of light coming through. And I just sort of, as a photographer, we live in a wash of sort of imagery and Instagram and also working commercially, I feel like a lot of stuff can kind of look a bit same. So it's hard to cut through and hard to really sort of forge a style or forge a signature in your work. As a photographer, he's someone that I sort of always looked up to and kind of always admired. Sort of moving out of that space, to be honest, I'm quite infatuated and almost obsessed with the work of the painter Jeffrey Smart. He's just always just been someone whose work I have idolized. And when I sort of was thinking about this today and kind of, some of the things we're going to touch on, I think, again, I look at his work and it's his ability to capture the light and sort of how he can kind of translate that to the viewer. And I think it's sort of, that's always what I'm trying to think about as sort of, how can we enhance that experience that sort of the viewer when they're looking at our work. I mean, those two just as sort of, a starting off point. I'm lucky enough to have, quite a broad network of friends who work in different creative fields and will pursue sort of different projects. And, I think I'm always up for having a chat about it and seeing, what my friends are up to and sort of, getting, motivated by that. If they're out there making work and doing exhibitions and sort of trying to push the limit in whatever their sort of creative pursuits are, that's only going to sort of drive my fuel and my fire a little bit more. But yeah, look, I would say, there are a few I could, rattle off a few more, but I think that it's, I always sort of come back to this idea again when I was thinking about this today is it's, the light is what drives me always. So it's funny when I talk about Joe's work, if I talk about someone like Jeffrey Smart, I'm like the key thing is the connector is light and sort of drawing on that and utilizing that. And I mean, that's, what we are doing as photographers.
What was the name of your Ivanoff book?
Yeah, Catching Light. Yeah, so there we go.
Nailed it.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, the other thing with Smart as well, I think. Oh, you go, Joe.
Oh, so the funny thing was, I think it was actually Stuart Harrison who coined that. That was, but no, it was definitely fitting. So yeah, sorry, David.
I know. I was just going to say the other thing that strikes me as you talk about Smart's work is the almost uncanny nature of it. That these very hyper observed settings, and yet often they are unpopulated scenes as well.
Mm-hmm.
Whether there's something to the uncanniness of Smart's work with like kind of roadways and industrial infrastructure and all these kind of monoliths without people. Is there something equally uncanny about a building with no people in it or a house with no residents?
I think when I look at Smart's work, obviously it's that like surrealist kind of nature. But you said before something about, or something that you noticed about sort of my work is that trying to create that sort of like emotive quality with light and even if it doesn't have people in it. So, I think that you can actually, I'm very happy to have people in my photographs. I love them for scale. I love them. I mean, humans intuitively sort of like want to connect with one another. And so I find that when I have a person in a photograph, the viewer is going to be sort of more drawn to it quite often on a sort of personal level. But there's something, quite sort of nice about when I look at the work of like those two artists that I've mentioned. Someone like Joe would sort of often have people at his work depending on what the architect wants. Obviously with Jeffrey, it depends. It's quite often the lone figure. And I'm a big fan of that as well. Just the one lone like businessman, like standing down there by the causeway or whatever it is, you're just sort of living in your own world and you can kind of, you can create this almost sort of fantasy, I guess. But one thing I will say is that I talk about this idea of sort of like honesty and kind of authenticity in the work I want to make. And I always think about that I want the spaces that I photograph and the photographs that I make to be a fairly sort of authentic representation of what the subject is. So when I look at Jeffrey Smart's work, that's not always the case because they're almost sort of borderline on these kind of like make-believe sort of landscapes or sort of, some real elements, some that almost feel sort of like dreamlike or kind of ethereal in a sense. But there's still something about the way that he captures that light that I think truly resonates with me as a photographer. And you talk about observing and looking at details. Like I could go up to one of his paintings and just look at the finest detail of a corrugated fence and how the shadow hits it. And that's the part that will like get me the most excited, like looking at like a bolt on a fence. So it's, you can definitely draw inspiration from sort of different places. But yeah, they're a few of my favorites.
I find it interesting. You mentioned that your friends do these. You've got lots of creative friends, and I can verify Jack knows everybody. So,
All the creatives.
yeah, but I think there's something in that. I wonder, it kind of validates that there's no reason not to just like pursue the things I need to get this into a question, but I guess it's like it gives you permission, right, to pursue a creative outlet when you see your friends all around you doing it, and you kind of realize you don't need anyone's permission to go and be creative or to do an art show or to stage an event. Like, you can actually do it yourself. So yeah,
Look, definitely. I would say, I mean, what's interesting is that when you make, I guess, like an interest or a passion your profession, your relationship inherently changes with it. Like, I was someone who really enjoyed photography and liked architecture, and I kind of put those two things together. But it's actually how I sustain a lifestyle now and provide, like, for myself. So, like, that's not lost to me, that sort of your relationship with that changes. And like, my wife, for example, has, made sort of some big strides in ceramics in the past several years and is getting very, very good at it. And I've had this talk with her quite often where I've said, it's not about selling work and it's not almost about exhibiting work. It's always just about making the work. And I think in enjoying that process and, you don't always have to have a commercial outcome from whatever you're doing. Like, I think that's something that has never been sort of more true to me. Like, the sort of the books and the personal projects that I've been pursuing, the reason I can kind of do those things is because I sort of do the commercial work. But I'm, sort of circling back to your question, Alicia, like, if I'm looking at
I
sort
don't
of
know
the
if there
people
was a
around,
question in there. But...
yeah, I just sort of want just sort of that idea of, I think, yeah, your statement piece. Just sort of looking at, I guess, by the friends around me. Like, I've got some friends that pursue their art practice all the time, full time, and that's what they do. Or they're like painters or designers or illustrators or whatever they're into. I've got some that just have it as a hobby and a side thing, and they keep it for themselves. And I have respect for them in sort of equal measure. Like, it doesn't make you a better art, whatever you want to call it, like, you don't have to make your work commercially viable to, like, I think it just comes down to just doing the work and do work that makes you happy and, like, feeds the soul. I would say that that's never been more important to me. Like, I'm on the cusp of sort of finishing off 2 books at the moment, and I've already got 2 more in mind. Like, people, like, I'm a bit of a sucker for punishment because it's a lot of work. It's a lot of the mental resources, sometimes the financial resources, depending on where the projects are. Other people might be like, oh, wow, you could be working and doing commissioned work. And, you're not, you're spending time making a book that's, maybe
not
not
a
going to pay
money-making
anywhere
venture.
near that. As you're going through it at the moment as well. But it's something that kind of, it feeds the soul. So I think surrounding yourself and like with creative people only can kind of like fuel that fire. But at the same time, not all my friends are creative either, which I like. I don't want to I don't hang out with a whole bunch of architects or like, I'm sort of, I'm quite interested. I always admire my friends actually who like just have like the 9-to-5 job that they're whatever jobs, they just make their money. And then all those friends have like the best hobbies. Like, they'll go like kayak riding on the weekend and go like rafting and rock climbing and like all this like wild stuff that when I get to the weekend, I'm like, no, I feel a bit more fulfilled about maybe what I've made during the week. So I don't really feel like I need to go climb a mountain, but I've got those friends.
I'm just thinking about, the bill paying, the commissioned work and process. Do you have a way that you approach each project that allows you to get into a flow? So, the preparation that then allows to chase the light or to capture the light as it occurs, or do you ever rock up and it's just like, wow, how are we going to do this today?
David, I'll be very honest. Like, some days are tougher than others. Like in that world, like I think I like to be well prepared. I hope the weather's on our side always. We're always watching the weather like a hawk in the lead up to shoot and just trying to, hopefully get a good day or a day that's going to be fitting to the project, because it always depends on what you're shooting as well. Like, and also shooting a house and using the light in a way that's actually going to show the best aspects of that house. So, but yeah, I think like good preparation is key. But also, like, I'll be very honest, like in the commission world, like, yeah, sometimes we're expected to rock up and pull a rabbit out of a hat. And that's sort of what we do. We show you absolutely the best parts of a project. And I mean, look, I'm quite lucky, obviously, at this point in my career where sort of the majority of projects I shoot are of a sort of certain caliber and kind of quality. And I get to work with some really great practitioners. And each project's different and challenging in its own right. And it's probably what keeps me quite engaged with the work as well. Like if I just photographed projects in Melbourne all the time, I'd feel like I could get a bit the same. Like obviously I photograph in Perth quite a bit, being from there. The climate's different, the architecture, their approach to the design is quite different because people inherently live, a different lifestyle for the majority of the year. Saying that, in terms of, I guess, how my approach changes, I think that personal work and my commissioned work, the lines just blur all the time. Like I don't have like a set approach to either or. Something I've been trying to push the last few years is probably trying to become almost a bit looser in my approach. Like I trained under some really, really well-known, like highly respected architectural interior photographers, and it was very structured, and they showed me the ropes and they taught me how, the industry works and technically how you need to photograph things and sort of all of these things that none of the stuff that you sort of did when you were studying. Like, I really learn't my practice and my craft through those years of assisting. I assisted for nearly 5 years before I went out on my own. But I think more recently, I'm almost trying to change my approach a bit and get a bit looser, like, and sort of, like not be afraid to jump off the tripod and walk around and take some handheld shots and kind of capture sort of more of these like fleeting moments. I don't want to dive into the whole AI thing just yet, but I'm sure that's going to come into it because I don't think you can chat about photography or anything creative at the moment without that coming into the discussion. But to me, it spurs from this idea of like, ultimately, I want to make work that when people look at it, there's no question as to whether or not it's a photograph. And I feel like there's a lot of stuff out there at the moment that's so blurring those lines or is just blatantly AI, like slop as everyone's calling it. And I never want my work to be in question. Like I want people to look at it and go categorically, that is a photograph. That's sort of what that would look like. That's quite important to me. And that's sort of part of my approach.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was starting to push at because similarly, I grew up in and around a very traditional kind of high-end portraiture studio, photographic studio, and it was, you bring people in, they pay very good money, and they'd take maybe 6 frames in a session, and it was perfectly lit. Everything was controlled. Control was the word. And we talked to a lot of creators about the idea of flow state. And getting to a point where you're actually so, whether it's prepared or in the moment or whatever it might be, that you're just kind of you're seeing it, you're responding to it, you're making the image, making the object, whatever it might be. And it sounds as though maybe your practice is starting to shift more openly into that.
That's where you want to be. Like it's that sweet spot, like where I'm sort of, when I'm on shoots, like I don't want to be having I'll quite often like put the phone away, leave it in the camera bag. I don't want emails and stuff to be coming in. I want to be focused on, I think we sort of have to like as well, like we usually get if it's a commission shoot, we usually get say a day to photograph it. It's not a lot of time to capture really the essence of a project that someone spent 3, 4, 5 years working on, and so it's not lost to me, sort of the weight of that. And, we've got to get an outcome, like we've got to deliver, we've got to get the shots. They've got to look beautiful. The client probably want it published. Like it is a bit of sort of pressure that falls on the photographer. So you want to be you want to be focused, you want to be in that zone, and it can be quite sort of stressful. I think probably what's nice about the personal work is that obviously you don't have that client breathing down your neck. And so I've had some pretty key collaborators with the projects I've done. The book in the US, I've had Tim and I've got another book here that's coming out later this year with Thames and Hudson that I've been working on with a good architect friend of mine, Jake Taylor. And sort of, he's been my key collaborator or almost the client, but not. And so in terms of kind of getting into that state, we just, we'll go to a house and spend a day there. but we only photograph what we want to photograph and what we think looks good. And we're still trying to tell that narrative and that story. But if we don't like something, we don't have to discuss with the client like why it is we do or don't want to include that as part of the set. We just don't do it, which is a really, really nice space to be. But, it's, I often find like my favorite time in a shoot, or probably that idea of that proper, like, that flow state or whatever that you speak about, generally comes towards the end of the day when you kind of feel like you've more or less got it in the bag. Like, you've got the shots that you need more or less to convey the story. And then it's kind of just fun and you can just sort of walk around and just find these moments. And that's like this idea of jumping off the tripod, being a bit looser in your approach. But it hasn't come naturally to me. Like I really had to push myself to get to that space. But I think it comes with years of experience and also just wanting to push yourself in a different direction and not just doing the same thing again and again. Like I want to be challenged in the work that I'm making. And I think I can see that how my work's evolved from like where I started with Ivanoff to, the work I'm making now. I think it's quite different and my understanding of the subject matter as well. But I'm constantly trying to get into that place. And I think I am a pretty focused person. Like if I'm there, like I'm in that moment. It's probably one of the things I love most about this profession and the work that I make is that like I can't really be thinking about something else. Like I have to. There's so much going on at that moment that you have to sort of focus on what's there in front of you. So that is that is something that's quite nice. It's rare that you have that. Most of us, there's 1,000 things going in, notifications, messages. Getting pulled every which way. Yeah.
You mentioned some collaborators there. What's the value to you, like in collaborating? Like talk through what that means, because I guess like photography could be quite a solitary pursuit otherwise.
Yeah, look, I think for the personal work, for the books, the collaboration's been key. Both the Studley Modern book that I've got coming out later this year with Hamptons and Hudson. So that's been working with Jake Taylor, who's an architect, friend of mine, very good friend, and he's literally done every shoot with me. He's written essays on the houses, done plans on the houses. So he's got an idea of how he wants them to be showcased in the photography. But at no point has he ever sort of put any constraints on me as to sort of how I should photograph. So what's been really nice is that it very much has been that working relationship where sort of, I'll tell them what I think is sort of, the best way to show a space or through a series of photographs or sort of, we should be capturing this element or we're missing this shot. We need to go back and get this. It's that idea of collaboration. I love, having someone who has a deep understanding of the subject that we're capturing actually just be a great counterpoint to the work I'm making. And we can talk like from the majority of the houses that we photographed for that book, that's going to be nearly 20 houses all up. Nearly every single house we've gone back and photographed at different times. Like sort of, it's been rare that we'd get one in a day. I'll say that much. And so what I've really enjoyed about the experience is that, we can sit back after a shoot, we can review the photographs. He can tell me if he feels there's anything missing, or he can write to sort of what I've, write about sort of it, and sort of sculpt his narrative and his story about what he wants to say about the project around the photos that I've made. And so everything becomes kind of intertwined and quite free flowing. And I just feel like you're right. Photography is quite a solitary pursuit in a lot of ways. And so I feel like that's, something that I'll probably continue to try and do is find those sort of collaborators. It just so happens both those book sort of opportunities came up around the same time, sort of just out of that, early out of COVID. The same working with Tim in New York, like if it wasn't for him, none of that would have happened. Like he was the connector to all of these owners. He lives out in Southampton. He, is very well known in that community, knows the architects, knows the designers, knows who's working on what house. And so really, he again didn't put any constraints on what he wanted me to photograph. He sort of knew what I was able to produce, but it's just, I've really enjoyed that process of being able to share the work with him throughout the course of making it. And we'll talk about it and decide if we wanted to shoot more. It's definitely a bit tricky, obviously, the New York thing, as opposed to like doing a project, 2 neighborhoods over from where I live. But it was, I I really sort of thrive on that kind of collaboration and sort of have really sort of enjoyed that. And I think it can only sort of enhance the work that I'm making as well. So yeah, to me, it's been a key part of those projects, and I think moving forward, would definitely be a key part of what I'm doing. Yeah, anything that can add more meaning to the whatever the subject it is that I'm photographing, I think is a good thing.
And you've been doing workshops with Leica. Is that something you're allowed to talk about? I don't know.
Yes. No, it is. Yeah, definitely.
That's lucky.
Okay.
I'm like, I think it's public.
Yeah. No, it is. No, it's up on their website. Yeah. So, look, this is a very new thing for me. So I shoot on Leica, have done so for the last few years. That was a very conscious decision. I'm actually quite happy when I started the book in the States in 23. Great decision to actually rent a Leica over there and start shooting that book on it. And so now that whole book and the one here has been done with Leica as well, obviously, but I was sort of in that kind of transition phase. But it's, I had Jesse Marlowe, who is a very great photographer in his own right, very talented. But he tapped me on the shoulder last year and said to come and have a chat to them. I think, it's sort of shooting architecture and interiors on Leicas. There's sort of not too many people doing it. And I think that Jesse makes beautiful publications in his own right and always has. And so I think, obviously I work commercially, but he sort of knew that I was making the books as well. And I feel like I was quite interested in that. So as it's transpired, they've sort of got me on to do a series of workshops. I did 2 last year, one in Melbourne and one in Sydney, where we sort of, we'll do a weekend workshop where sort of I'll talk about my practice. Then we'll go and photograph a mid-century house. So we went to Wall Street House, the iconic Robin Boyd House in Melbourne, and the Rose Seidler House in Sydney. I was up in Sydney a couple of weekends ago. Doing another one, and I've actually got one again here in Melbourne this weekend. This weekend's a bit of a special one. We're actually shooting the Featherston House, so that should be quite exciting. But yeah, look, I'll be very honest. I never really saw myself doing teaching. I don't know, like it sort of took me a bit by surprise, I guess, when they came and spoke to me. But I've really enjoyed it. It's been a really nice change of pace. I think it's got me to stop for the first time in quite a long time and actually think about, I guess, my practice, why I'm making the work I'm doing, sort of, I guess, what the work I want to be making moving forward. And like I sort of touched on previously, I'm always trying to find that balance of like doing enough commissioned work that it sustains what I need to, but then doing the personal projects. And to me, it's just like another sort of added piece to that, like another sort of, feather in the hat, I guess, like to have some of the teaching stuff on the side. I mean, look, they've been fantastic to collaborate with. And I don't know if I am meant to say this, but I will. Well, I'm heading out to Palm Springs with them next week to go and do a scouting trip for a workshop that we're planning out there next year. So probably by the time this gets published, they'll, that will be all out next month. So, obviously it's a really, really nice opportunity. Palm Springs is one of my absolute favorite places in the world, and Modernism. So, it's opportunities that I sort of didn't see coming, but at the same time, I've really kind of embraced them and enjoyed them. And look, I think it's nice. It's nice to be able to share your experience with people. Nice to chat with people that are just enthusiastic about sort of making photographs, about architecture, about sort of the work that I make. And it's quite an eclectic, like quite a diverse group of sort of people that seem to come through the workshops as well. So yeah, I'd say, yeah, I'm definitely enjoying the experience. Yeah, it wasn't on my bingo card, but it's, I'm grabbing the opportunity with both hands, and it's, it's been fun so far. So yeah, we'll see where it all goes.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Should we talk about AI before we talk about death? I mean, that may be a natural progression. I'm not sure.
It's definitely a natural progression. Yeah.
I'm interested from your perspective in the spaces in which you work. What does AI kind of present or represent to you, to your workflow, to your world at the moment?
Yeah, look, it depends which photography you talk to, I guess. Obviously, in terms of embracing the advancements for like retouching in the editing side of things and sort of what you can do with that. I think it's brilliant. We used to always sort of laugh at, like a client would be like, oh, can you just remove that car? There's no button for it, and we'd be like, oh, there's no button for that in Photoshop. Like that kind of almost is now. That's what's sort of funny. Or the remove power line button, or, it's sort of, it's definitely getting to that point. Yeah, exactly. It's definitely getting to that point. But I guess as a photographer, look, I'll be very honest. I've thought about this a lot. Like, how can we not working in a creative field at the moment? It's absolutely just like changing and evolving at such a rapid pace. But
yeah,
I'm very glad that I work in architecture. Basically, as a photographer who documents architecture, over the past decade or so, renders and sort of 3D renders and kind of like that whole sort of, line of imagery has progressively gotten better and better. But no matter how lifelike and sort of realistic it's become, it will never or has not surpassed the photographs of a built tangible product. So, ultimately, an architect wants to see a photograph of something that is exactly that, built and tangible and real. And a photograph is the physical representation of that. I think with the whole AI stuff, like if I was, a still life photographer or a fashion photographer, or, there's a whole lot of other areas that, they're definitely going to.
The Amex campaign, I was saw a huge billboard in the city the other day, 100% an AI avatar. I was like, it's so obviously AI. So Amex obviously don't want to pay for talent anymore.
No, I think, I've read some stuff as well. Like humans have an uncanny ability at the moment to still spot when something's just that little bit off. You can't quite put your finger on it, but you inherently sort of like intuitively sort of know that like that something's just that little bit off. But I guess I'm grateful for where I come into photography, because I feel like I can't see a world in the short to medium term where render is going to surpass, something that's built and tangible and real. And the photograph that I make of that is what's going to be the representation of that project. But I'd be very, very nervous if I worked in a lot of other parts of photography or a lot of other professions as well. I guess that sort of, yeah, it's not like anyone is like in writing, like, journalism. I think that ultimately I had a recently, things like books and making physical, like tangible sort of objects, I would say are going to become even, are going to become even more important. Like, remember like 10, 15 years ago, they were going to say, they've said the print media was dead. It's never going to, it's never going to continue. The internet's going to take over, AI is coming and all of the above. And people are still, or magazines are still selling, there's still a multitude of publications out there. People are still making wonderful books. Like I think we need to embrace the technology, definitely. Like it's that thing of like stampede or get trampled, I guess, and that sort of mentality. But at the same time, anything that has that human touch to it, I almost feel will be more important in the years to come. And it's obviously a weird time because it's just changing so rapidly, like nobody can kind of keep up.
Yeah.
But not so I can break a record, but yeah, I feel like in architecture and the work that I make commercially, I feel like is okay for now. And it almost, if I reflect on sort of the personal work, it always feels even more important to keep documenting like that sort of historic architecture and the modernist stuff. And, like at the end of the day, like these are the visual records that we'll have, and one day they won't be there anymore. So yeah, it almost does sort of drive me in a sense as well.
I wonder if there's an opportunity as well in it that, human beings have a wonderfully contrarian way of responding to these kind of changes. And I wonder whether creativity is an opportunity. You think about like photography as a medium with daguerreotypes coming in and fine art changing from literal representation to all the abstracted movements that then came out of that kind of visual human expression through the early part of the 20th century. And just throwing back to our first part of our conversation when you were talking about your ability to be able to find the moments, find the details. You could spend a day going around taking photos of things that, by the process of synthesis of a hierarchy of importance in architecture or people or whatever, a computer might say, well, that's not the important thing. And yet, if you can create a little world and create a meaningful image, an impactful or memorable image out of that, that moment, that transient moment. There's something pretty special to that. I mean, that's the hopeful viewpoint, I guess. But
I think so. Yeah. Glass half full. I love that, David.
Yeah.
I think we all have to.
Well,
look,
people are still painting.
In these dark times, I think that I love an optimist because I don't know, it can be some days it can be a bit all encompassing, it's just too much. So I agree. Like I think people will find a way to embrace it and then sort of reinterpret it. Like I said, sort of I don't think we should be fearful of it, but it's definitely that transitional period where things will settle down. But it makes me want to sort of, I guess, double down on like kind of keeping the personal work going. Keep documenting real tangible things and the sort of touchstones of like authenticity and like honesty and whatever it is that you're making, like that real human element and human touch. People just want to connect with other people, not with machines.
Exactly like you said as well. Why are we doing it? If we're just making images in order to expedite transactions and commerce, then maybe that's better left to the computers. Maybe the human thing is to make the thing that you have to make.
Yeah,
honestly, you can't make anything else.
Yeah. Look, I remember I had one project started out where I had this client once a few years ago that more or less wanted us to like edit this photograph to a point where like it actually just did not represent in any way, shape or form what it was we photographed. And I remember turning around to the photo assistant and I was like, I just would not want to work with this person again because basically they just wanted a render. Like, and I'm not there to make a render. Like, I'm just not interested. If there are photographers there that will basically make you renders, but just so they can, if you want the absolute perfect image, just use AI, like use a render. I don't know. Don't use a photographer just to call it a photograph. Yeah, I think it seems kind of, counterintuitive, just pointless.
Well, on that note, we have our final question.
Yes.
And so we ask all our guests the same question, which is, if you could design your death, what would that be? Do you want to leave a legacy? What would your, what do you want to leave behind? So you can interpret it. Look, we're open. This is a creative question in its truest sense. So.
I think this is a good one. I'm not going to lie. I can't say I've really thought about this at length, but I do like the question. So I'll start with this. In terms of legacy, that is definitely something that's very important to me and something that I do think about quite a bit. The books to me are my legacy. Ivanoff being involved with that project, having my name sort of attached to that as being sort of really special. And I think it doesn't sort of matter how many editorials I do or sort of commercial projects, they kind of can become a bit of a wash, in amongst all the others. Whereas I feel like the books, the projects that I've spent 2, 3, 4, Ivanoff going on 10 years on, I think, from a legacy perspective, they're sort of what my work will be remembered for. Really, I guess sort of, I want things to really be meaningful and sort of capture that specific moment in time and sort of, those books to me capture a specific moment in our built history, and then I'm sort of reinterpreting it in a sort of contemporary setting. But I hope that people will look back on them in years to come and that the photos will still be strong and still be a great representation of that. So, I would say the legacy piece is a big one for me and something that is, I do think about quite a bit. In terms of how I designed my death, I actually had a bit of fun thinking about this. I was sort of like, when it's all said and done, like, how do you want to go? I haven't quite landed on how I want to go exactly. I think that might take a little bit more thought, but I could say this much. In terms of the party, I would sort of picture sunset overlooking the ocean, sort of with all my guests there and all the friends, absolutely just glowing in the twilight. That to me would just be
the golden hour.
The golden hour would be absolutely perfect. As sort of, you'd mentioned kind of, what would people be wearing? I would say navy always. Navy is my color. I'm sort of, I'm not the.
You're
I'm not
representing
the typical,
today too.
Always. So I want all my people to be in navy. the playlist would sort of, start with kind of old, classic sort of hip hop tracks and then lead into some really nice sort of housey kind of like party vibes. I was thinking sort of Tribe Called Quest and De La Soul just to sort of kick off the vibe and then sort of move
perfect
into
sunset
that.
music.
Perfect sunset music. And honestly, I would just want everyone to be enjoying themselves and drinking ice cold martinis all night long and just having a wonderful party. So yeah, really sort of, I guess, I hope that sort of sets a bit of a scene as to kind of how I would imagine it to sort of go. It wasn't something that I've ever given much thought to before today, but I really do enjoy the question. And look, those ideas might change, but at this moment in time, I feel like that's a good starting point. And I feel like most people would want to attend that party. I just want just a big party.
I love how you instantly think about the daylight, the light. What will the light setting be?
Of course.
I was going to say it's the most photographer response to that question we've ever had.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, it has to be at golden hour.
Yeah. Everybody's got to look their best. Yeah. Everyone's got to look their best. So no, it's a it was an interesting one to land on. I'll have to come back to you on how do I want to go out, but I don't know.
Leave that up to chance.
Exactly. A camera won't be too far away from me, I'd imagine. But yeah, we'll see.
Oh, well, Jack, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your creative journey with us.
Absolute pleasure, guys. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome.
You've been listening to Creative or Dead. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we would like to pay respects to elders past and present, extending that acknowledgement to all First Nations and Indigenous peoples around the world.
If you've enjoyed listening to this episode, you can find many more like it on whatever platform you get your podcasts. And if you've really enjoyed it, please feel free to leave us a review or to share it with someone that you think might find it interesting.